In any event, welcome to the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University's discussion on After Afghanistan, American Foreign Policy After 20 Years of War. I'm former Congressman Steve Israel, and so wonderful to be joined by two members of Congress with whom I served, Congressman Jim Himes, who presently serves in Congress in Connecticut. Give him a big hand for joining us. And former Congressman Chris Shays from Connecticut. Give Congressman Shays a big hand. I'm going to introduce them properly in just a moment. I also want to acknowledge Professor Sarah Kreps, who will be leading us in conversation. Professor, thank you, not only for your expertise, give Professor a big hand, but also your service to our country as a member of the United States Air Force. Thank you for everything that you have done. This is actually our first event, our first live event since March of 2020, and what better topic, what more important, fundamentally important and profound topic than an assessment of Afghanistan, not just the past, this is not a historical reprise, but where are we going with foreign policy? How will what is happening in Afghanistan today, what has happened over the past several weeks, how will that impact U.S. foreign policy going forward? This is part of a day-and-a-half conference that has been organized by Professor Doug Kreiner, who's the faculty director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. Tomorrow, he and some of his academic colleagues will be engaged in a conversation on the issue at a deeper academic level. And we're grateful to Professor Kreiner for his leadership. I also want to acknowledge our brand new Associate Executive Director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, Erin King, who is with us. Erin served as a Republican member of the Huntington Town Board on Long Island. The Hempstead Town Board on Long Island. She now lives in South Carolina. Her father, if you don't mind me saying, is probably known to many of you. He is former Congressman Peter King.
Don't hold it against me.
We won't hold that against us. And I also want to thank Emily Anderson, who's our Director of Programming, for her work on this as well. The Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell, for those of you who are unaware, has three discrete missions. The first is to deepen discourse and raise understanding on really complex and volatile issues. So we don't talk in sound bites. We bring people together, real experts and political practitioners, to really delve into what's behind the headlines, and we do it in a very agile way. So on January 6th, I'm sorry, not on January 6th, but days after January 6th, when President Trump was impeached, we had two of Jim's colleagues, Congressman Josh Gottheimer, a Democrat, and Congressman Tom Reed, a Republican, talk about whether Congress could find a way to function together in light of what happened on January 6th and the second impeachment of President Trump. Shortly after she became Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi was in this building doing a briefing on her legislative priorities. Shortly after he left the Trump administration, former Trump Chief of Staff Reince Priebus was with us in this building talking about his perspectives, and boy did he have stories to tell about the Trump administration. We had your colleague Peter DeFazio with us, Jim, just weeks ago, talking about what was going to happen with the infrastructure bill, the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. So we bring people in not just to help us explore headlines, but people who are making headlines at that moment. Second thing we do is we provide connectivity between Cornell faculty and policymakers. We try and inform policy, and we also try and invest faculty and academics in understanding political considerations and practical political considerations when they are informing policy. And the third thing we do is provide unique opportunities for our students. We bring them to Washington. I had I teach a course 2 weeks ago. I had Congressman Adam Schiff do a guest lecture on our course, on our opening course, so we provide that connectivity. Tonight we've assembled a panel as expert and as unique as you could possibly get. If you are a political junkie, you know that Chris Shays and Jim Himes opposed each other in 2008. Now it's rare, I hope you appreciate how rare it is that you would have two opponents joining together for a cerebral and respectful conversation about an issue as contentious as Afghanistan. But that's what we do. We bring people together different perspectives for that kind of respectful and deep conversation. And I had the privilege of serving with both of them in my 16 years in Congress. Before I properly introduce them, I do want to do some housekeeping. Both members of Congress will offer their top-line remarks, about 5 minutes each, and then Professor Kreps will moderate a conversation between them. I have received hundreds of pre-submitted questions. I have about 2 or 3 that I'll try and insert in that conversation. We'll have about 20 minutes for you of live Q&A, and then we'll break at that point. So let me begin by introducing Congressman Jim Himes. He is a Democrat serving his 7th term in the House of Representatives, representing Connecticut's 4th Congressional District. He serves as chairman of the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness in Growth. He serves as chair of the National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy Subcommittee of the House Financial Services Committee, serves on the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He was born in Lima, Peru, attended Harvard University, which not too bad, I mean, by Cornell standards, it's okay. Was a Rhodes Scholar, a leading voice in Congress on intel issues and financial services. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my former colleague, Congressman Jim Himes from Connecticut. Jim?
Thank you.
Wherever you want, that's fine.
No, okay. Stay here. Well, Steve, thank you. A big thank you to Cornell and to Steve Israel. It is just such a thrill for me to, first of all, be with humans in person, but in particular these 2 humans who are my colleagues and past colleagues. There aren't that many members of Congress who have the integrity and the intelligence and the commitment to really good policy as Chris Shays and Steve Israel. So I'm just delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to have met Professor Kreps. So 5 minutes. You see, in the House we can do 5 minutes. In the Senate, 5 minutes turns into an hour. So I'm going to try to be disciplined about 5 minutes and offer just 2 thoughts, maybe 3 thoughts, as quickly as I can. The title and the subject of this is about Afghanistan, 20 years of war. My first thought for you is that, and I want to say this very carefully, without any sense of flippant, without any humor, I want to say that it is probably 19 years past time that we right-size the nation's commitment of its psychology, of its dollars, of its people to Afghanistan. I know that that's what we're here to talk about tonight. But in the long run, relative to the strategic challenges that the United States faces, and I could rattle them off and they'd be familiar to you, the rise of China, the instability and sort of vandal-like quality of Russia, the fact that Pakistan sits on dozens of nuclear weapons, which by the way has an Afghanistan nexus, I could go on and on and on. Relative to all of those profound strategic concerns and threats, Afghanistan is not that. It's not top 5, it's probably not top 10. And so, by all means, the historians and those of us charged with accountability and oversight should do the work of figuring out what the Biden administration got wrong. I've got some thoughts on that. And by the way, what every other presidential administration in the last 20 years, that's Trump, that's Obama, that goes back to George W. Bush, got wrong, because there is plenty of blame to go around. But it's obviously a humbling moment. I do think that there's a conversation to have about, apart from accountability, about whether this moment has sort of lasting implications. Americans, of course, are fairly famous in terms of their lack of interest in foreign policy. Yes, Joe Biden's numbers are down. I suspect those numbers will go up and down an awful lot in the next 3 years of his administration. For political purposes, of course, the Republican Party will look to keep this alive, but I'm not convinced that even in the American political mind, this is going to have profound implications. I was talking to the professor earlier. I have a very smart friend who called this Joe Biden's Waterloo. Come on, right? No, this is not a defeat in a world war that is going to require a complete revamping of the government, the way Napoleonic France had to do after Waterloo. There's an argument to be made because, of course, what about United States credibility? Well, what's the definition of credibility? Maybe it's the president, for the first time, actually doing what the president said he was going to do, which is to withdraw from Afghanistan. So I think that's all interesting stuff. But the one enduring lesson, I think, that I think is actually a healthy lesson. And this is not an easy thing to say because Americans like to win, but one of the enduring lessons of Afghanistan is also one of the enduring lessons of Iraq, of our activities in Syria, of our activities in Libya, which is that we have a military and an intelligence community that is absolutely second to none. Not even by orders of magnitude does anybody compete at a tactical level. So if you need to remove a terrorist from the battlefield, as they say, if you need to hunt down the chief terrorists in the city that houses the Pakistani military academy, if you need to roll back an invasion of Kuwait, at a tactical level, our hard power is unsurpassed. There's almost no evidence that from a less tactical, more strategic point of view, that we can get what we want. Now, okay, Kuwait, Grenada, we could all list areas and reasons why, and I'll close with some thoughts around that. We do achieve some things strategically. But in particular, when it comes to remaking a country, and this is not a new thing, we're not very good. Again, I listed Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. In none of those countries, even though we tried different combinations, in one place we went in big time force, Iraq militarily, Afghanistan we started with big time force, we pared back our efforts. In Libya we didn't use our military, but we backed up the Europeans and sort of went in light. In Syria we didn't do much other than have the president say a red line that he ultimately didn't enforce. You wouldn't look at any one of those four cases and say, that's the model, that's what we want to do. And by the way, this goes back generations, right? You name it, with the exception of Grenada, from well before I was a child, when we go in and try to alter a society, we don't get it right. 1954, Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, we overthrow a democratic elected president. Guatemala, for 2 generations, becomes arguably the most violent and vile country in Central America. Iran, Mossadegh, right? The United States decides it's going to participate in the overthrow of a reasonably democratic prime minister, and I wouldn't say that modern day Iran is totally about what happened with Mossadegh, but it has something to do with it. And I could go on and on around those regions. By the way, this is something that the intelligence agencies understand, that when we try to fundamentally strategically alter a country, we usually don't get it right. So that leads to my last point, which is I think this is a moment of actually really constructive humility for the country. And let me use a different word than humility. Let me use responsibility. Because there are plenty of examples of our getting it right? And sort of George H.W. Bush, of course, reversal of the invasion of Kuwait is one of those. Again, working very closely with our allies for limited aims. Remember how much trouble George H.W. Bush got when he didn't go on to Baghdad? Well, he's looking pretty smart now, isn't he? You can go on and show areas where when we've worked patiently with other countries, we achieve good strategic ends. Last thought, should that trouble us? I don't think so. I think, and again, I was talking to a professor earlier, take the historical perspective. I was born in Latin America in the mid-1960s. At that time, pretty much every country in Latin America was under some form of autocracy or military dictatorship. Today, with the exception of Venezuela and Cuba, maybe a few others, none are. Asia, same story. Korea, read the history of South Korea, just a vicious, vicious regime that has evolved. Nobody looks at Venezuela and says, we want to do it that way. Nobody looks at Egypt and says, we should do it that way. And that's really important to our strategic foreign policy, because I really do believe that our strategic foreign policy is about carefully, patiently, strategically moving the world in the direction, I won't necessarily use the word democracy, but to an accountable, responsive government. And maybe I'm overly optimistic, maybe even naive, but you can't look at history in the last 60 years and not acknowledge that that has been the trend. It's hard to point to countries that have retrograded from a democracy. By the way, I know in this political moment, many countries, including our own, are maybe doing a little less than we would like against autocracy. But what are the lessons? When we try to do it with the 82nd Airborne of the United States Marines, we almost always get it wrong. But when we do it carefully and patiently, and understanding that the currents of history are flowing ideologically in the American, I don't mean to say American, but in sort of Western liberalism, some version of capitalism, over time it moves in that direction. And that's hard to say because, of course, if you're an elected politician, you want to stand on a soapbox and say, our troops are going in and we're going to win. But the reality is that's not when we win. We win when we understand that the currents are flowing in our direction, and we just need to be careful, work in concert with our allies, and show some patience.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Very insightful. Thank you. Congressman Chris Shays is a Republican who also represented the 4th Congressional District of Connecticut from 1987 to 2009. He has been widely described on both sides of the aisle as one of the most moderate Republicans in the United States Congress. He served as ranking member of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee Subcommittee on National Security and Foreign Affairs, served on the House Financial Services Committee, Subcommittee on Capital Markets, Insurance, and Government-Sponsored Enterprises. We served together on that subcommittee, as I recall, and the Subcommittee on Housing and Community Opportunity, served on the Homeland Security Committee, Subcommittee on Intelligence, Information Sharing, and Terrorism Risk Assessment. And after Congress, he became the co-chair of the Commission on Wartime Contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Please welcome Congressman Chris Shays.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
So let me just first say a pleasure to have served with Steve, and a real honor to be in front of you and have this opportunity. An honor to be by my former congressman. I wish he had run about 4 years later, because I really would have liked to have had 4 more years in Congress. But it is a true pleasure to have at least lost to someone who I respect tremendously. So let me do something in 1 second. I once was giving a talk when Mayor Bloomberg did a fundraiser, and I didn't know how to end it, so I kept going on, and I saw my daughter walk out, and then I saw my wife walk out, and my daughter said, "Dad, we need to go running tomorrow," and she was down in Washington. We went running, and I tried to say to her before, "Sweetheart, I know I spoke too long. I know I could have done a better job. I just didn't know." "Dad, you were terrible." "Sweetheart, I know that." "Dad, it was embarrassing." So she's made me use my 5-minute clock. I will stop no matter what I'm saying, 5 minutes. President Eisenhower, in his farewell address to Congress, said, he warned us about the military-industrial complex, that it would have a more distorted power over public policy than other needs like soft power. But let me tell you three remarkable things that made me feel very proud of my country. I was in Congress when the Cold War had ended, and Lech Walesa came and addressed us. And I thought he'd be a giant, and he was about 5'6" or 5'5", and he walked by, and he got up and was just barely over the lectern, and he said, and I have to tell you, every time I think about it, it touches me. He said, "When I climbed over the chain link fence to go back into the yard," and he said, "and I thought I might be killed, I knew there was one place in the world that would celebrate my courage, my motivation, and remember what I did. And that was right here in the institution I'm at." I felt so proud, and I felt so emotionally impressed by what he said. He was willing to die knowing that there was a place in the world that would remember him. And a month later, this was in 89, he came in November, and then President Václav Havel, who had been in prison a month before, comes and addresses Congress. And he said, "Your soldiers are buried in our land in Europe after World War I. And then you came again, and more of your soldiers are buried in our land. And then this is what I always remember. And then you prevented the nightmare of communism from pushing the free world into the sea." And then he said, "We have no right to ask you to do anything more." That is a stunning, to me, salute to our country by two remarkable men. And then you had Nelson Mandela come shortly after, expressing love, peace, and harmony after 27 years in Africa, when we had a policy that said, "South Africa, you can't continue to do this, and have any interaction with the United States. So that was hard power and soft power, and it was a huge success. My criticism is that we are clueless to culture. And one of the things that I admire about this man, and one of his strengths, and he doesn't even maybe know it, he lived overseas. He saw other cultures. He's so identified to the other cultures that intuitively he would react to it. When we went into Iraq, when we went into Afghanistan, we were totally clueless to the cultures of those countries. I went in 19 times to Iraq. I was chair of the Committee on National Security and the Government Oversight Committee, and we dedicated ourselves to terrorism from '89 on. And when I went there, one of the men I spoke, his name happened to be Mohammed. I was there just even before the war had ended, and he told me about his rough life being in prison in Iran, and then he's back in Iraq, and he got married at age 55. And I said, "Boy, you've had a tough life." He said, "What do you mean, a tough life?" His life was no different than anybody else in Iraq. He didn't think it was tough. And then he practically put his hands on my shoulders and said, "You don't know us, and we don't know you." And that's the reason we have had total failure in both Iraq. Total is a wrong statement. A failure in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And when I went to the Northern Territory of Pakistan and met with the northern governor of the state of Pakistan, he said, "Why are you here? All you did was push the Taliban and ISIS into our northern territory." And at the same time, he showed me an article of the ambassador from Russia who had been part of the KGB when they were actually in Russia. And Russia was actually in Afghanistan. And he said, "Why are you making the same mistake we did? You at least should have learned from what we did." So humility is needed. A recognition of soft power is needed. And I have only 3 seconds left. So
Thank you very much. Congressman Shays. Sarah Kreps is the John L. Wetherell Professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University. She's an adjunct professor of law and the director of the Cornell Tech Policy Lab at Cornell University. Her teaching and research focuses on the intersection of international politics, technology, and national security. She's written 5 books, including most recently Social Media and International Relations. Other books include Taxing Wars, The American Way of War, Finance and the Decline of Democracy, Drones, What Everybody Needs to Know, Drone Warfare, and Coalitions of Convenience, United States Military Interventions After the Cold War. Her opinions are widely featured in platforms including the Washington Post, the New York Times, BBC, USA Today, CNBC, and CNN. She's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and has had fellowships at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a life member, Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, West Point, and the University of Virginia's Miller Center for Public Affairs. She has a BA from Harvard, an MSc from Oxford, and PhD from Georgetown. And as I mentioned before, between 1999 and 2003, she served as an active duty officer in the United States Air Force. Professor, thank you for being our moderator.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's such a distinguished crowd and a distinguished panel here. And it's also really powerful to be in New York on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I was in uniform on that day, stationed right outside Boston. And it felt like a very kind of watershed moment. So talking about kind of the last 20 years and putting this in both historical perspective but policy perspective is really interesting. I was struck by the comments that were made by both of you in terms of kind of where kind of the types of decisions, the foreign policy decisions that the U.S. has made. And I wanted to start with something that kind of, again, in the spirit of bipartisanship, really unified your perspectives, which is the sense of humility, the sense that the U.S. doesn't necessarily understand the countries in which it's intervening. And I guess I'm curious whether you can elaborate on where that leaves us. You had mentioned kind of that we are naive and we needed to have more constructive humility and responsibility. And Congressman Shays had talked about kind of the way in which we need to understand different cultures. So what is that sort of the recipe for in terms of where we should be thinking about how we allocate our efforts, how we allocate our intentions and resources? So if not in these countries, because it seems like in Grenada, it's interesting that you mentioned this as a success story, because it's not always viewed in that way. So where are the success stories, and why should then the U.S. ever kind of consider trying to kind of be muscular around the world?
I'll quickly offer a thought there. I think that Americans alive today are a little over-conditioned by what happened between 1941 and 1989. So in World War II, the United States does a truly national whole-of-government deployment and defeats fascism. And of course, in 1989, we see the Soviet Union crumble. Those are massive strategic events. It's the destruction of fascism and the destruction of communism. But we, I think, overemphasize to some extent our role in those two things, and we underemphasize the role of others. So, Congressman Shays is exactly right with respect to culture. It's also true with respect to history. Even in this room, people underappreciate the fact that without the Soviet Union fighting the Nazis at Stalingrad straight back to Berlin with a loss of 20 million Russians, who knows how World War II ends? But we don't really know that, right? It's not necessarily taught. The Cold War, okay, there's an argument to be made that over time there was just no way for a terribly inefficient economic system to outcompete a very efficient capitalist system. And yes, Ronald Reagan sort of upped the stakes to the point where they finally tipped over. And so I think we've overlearned the lessons of the dramatic strategic changes. And even though we experienced Korea, which was an ambiguous outcome, still today, Vietnam, which was not an ambiguous outcome and not one that we want to revisit, we continually go back because I think we probably underappreciated that. And, last thought, this is a wonderful thing about Americans, but we think that we can make the world a better place. And there are lots of ways that we can, but not in Vietnam. And not in Afghanistan if the agent of change is the 82nd Airborne and the United States Marines, especially, and this is where it comes back to Congressman Shays, you want to feel good about your country, spend time around 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old Marines and soldiers. They're just, it almost chokes you up, the level of dedication. But, these are young guys out of Western Virginia, right? They don't speak Pashto, right? They don't understand the ethnic politics that obtain in a place like Afghanistan. And that's not in any way to be critical of them, it's to be critical of the policymakers who send them to Lashkar Gah and say, fix this.
I am struck by the fact that we haven't had much success recently, and we've made a lot of mistakes. And so we say to Gaddafi, you're a bad guy, give up your bad ways, and we can work with you, and so on. And the next thing we're doing, we're overthrowing him. That meant there's not a chance in hell that the leader in North Korea will ever, ever, ever trust that if we said that to him, life will be good. So that little mistake, quote unquote, into this ridiculous, not a well thought of leader in Northern Africa had huge impact on what happens in Korea, and we just don't have a comprehension of it. I talked about culture. We also need to know about history. And if we know about their history and we know about their culture, we will make wiser decisions. I supported going into Iraq, and I can't tell you the work I did to try to figure that. The Brits, the French, the Israelis, the Turks, President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Bush, Powell, he's got weapons, we need to go there. Well, I'll tell you one thing. When I went there the first time, I wanted to weep. I went into Iraq, and all I saw were these little thin lines of electric lines going to all these stores and houses. And I thought, oh sure, this country is developing nuclear weapons? I don't think so. which leads me to make a point that we need to have ambassadors in every country. We need an ambassador in Iran. We need an ambassador in North Korea. We need to have people there who will get a better picture of what's happening in those countries. And I'll just salute the military in this one point. When I traveled, the military would always be the ones to introduce me to the country. If I went wherever, in France or wherever, I would get to meet with powerful military leaders who had been to West Point, who had been involved with our troops and so on. When I went to Pakistan, it was cold. They wanted very little to do with me because all their training was in Russia. So anytime we can have full interaction with peoples around the world, bring them to this country, interact with them, and I think it would make a difference.
Let me ask a question on behalf of Paul Piscitelli. Submitted a question, a very basic question for both members of Congress. Are we safer on September 11th, 2021 than we were on September 11th, 2001? Chris, you want to?
Yeah, I'll go first. It depends. Depends how you define safer. I had a hearing in my committee, and it was on, I was focused on terrorism. So it was on biological agents, it was on nuclear material, it was on chemical warfare, and this one was about biological agents. And I asked the witnesses at the end, I said, is there anything we should have asked you that you wanted to share? Is there anything you prepared for that you think is important to put on the record? And a doctor from a major medical magazine said, I want to tell you my biggest fear. My biggest fear is that a small group of dedicated scientists will create a biological agent that will wipe out humanity as we know it. I'm not comfortable right now with COVID. I'm not comfortable with our failure to come to grips with the fact that it may have come out or may not have from that plant. But I do know this, the Chinese could have been more helpful in making sure we knew about it sooner. And what I have a great fear is Americans seem clueless as to the need to why we need to contain this. So you have the Delta variants, but maybe you'll have a Delta variants times 10 if so many people are willing to risk they're being getting this and that it grows. So I can't feel safe right now as it relates to that one issue.
Jim, are we safer now than we were 20 years ago?
Well, the question is leading the witness, right? The question is obviously about terrorism because of the September 11th reference. I mean, I can say with some authority as a member of the Intelligence Committee that the probability that a transnational terrorist group is going to organize a large-scale attack on the United States that kills thousands of Americans, and we're not going to have any clue about it, is not zero, but pretty close to zero.
I agree with that.
Yeah, we dedicated very literally trillions of dollars. Kind of rewrote the way we thought about civil liberties, rewrote the law to make that so. Now, does that mean that there is any possibility we could stop a cell of 2 people with firearms? No, of course not. You don't want to live in a society that eliminates the possibility of a lone actor. So the question, as phrased, is not at all. I think is not that.
Depends on the issue.
So if it's terrorism, there's no question that our military and the intelligence community. But Congressman Shays is exactly right. I mean, think about it. Here we sit. Imagine if any one of us had been told 2 years ago that 2 years from now you're going to be sitting in a room contemplating the death of 666,000 Americans. We would say you're nuts, you're crazy. So we do tend to look in the wrong places, right? I think Congressman Shays is exactly right. It's as some of the military says, it's the bullet you don't see that kills you. So is Russia a bigger problem today than it was 10 years ago? Sure it is. Is Pakistan scary because now the Taliban may turn their attention to their patrons, who happen to sit on a bunch of nuclear weapons? That's scary. North Korea is really scary. I think that most of those challenges some of them are really scary, but are manageable. But my gosh, we've lost more Americans in the last 18 months than we lost in all of our wars combined, or something like that, right? And so we got to be a little bit. In some ways, I'm bridling at the question because if what we really care about is the security of the nation, national security, let's not stare down alleys. Let's look at where the threats may come from.
which implies, I think, that having more aircraft carriers or more planes may not be where we want to put our resources.
Mindful of time here.
Well, we did get a bit of a late start, so Congressman Himes, I know that you need to leave. Originally it was 7:15, but can we push a little bit?
Go as long as you want.
You're a good man. Okay, please. I lost the crowd on that one, didn't I?
Till 10 o'clock.
It's his bedtime.
And I think this is a great perspective that the one in which this is not just, even though we're sort of organized around the withdrawal of Afghanistan, and that's sort of on our minds, but we also have this contending issue of COVID. But I'm going to come back a little bit to the more kind of strategic questions, because both of you had experience on these committees. One of the things that my students ask a lot, I'm teaching the Introduction to International Relations at Cornell right now, so I have 100-something students, and they're very curious about a lot of things, which is great. One of the ones that comes up is, they weren't around in Vietnam, but look at Vietnam, we look at history, and what did we not learn? And one of the other sets of questions that comes up that I think is worth contemplating is the role of credibility, and that's something they asked me just this morning, in fact, is what should we think about, or how much should we take seriously this question of whether U.S. credibility was lost with the way the withdrawal from Afghanistan was handled, and what are countries like Russia and China and Iran observing from that behavior?
Yeah, let me just say, if I could go first here. What's disappointing is that when we left, we went in and basically got our allies to follow us, and NATO was there in Afghanistan. When we left, we didn't consult them, basically. We just said we're leaving. And they had to follow up, and they're not going to continue to stay. So we really didn't make it a joint decision. I mean, you may know something that I don't know, and maybe you can't even share it, but the general feeling I had was that we did not give them the respect they deserved based on their responses. And so I think we lost a lot of credibility with our allies, which I know President Biden really wants to improve, unlike the previous president. So that's, one of the challenges we have in foreign policy is if we know we have to do something, it's going to have a negative impact here. Sometimes the public wants us to do something, but because we know it's going to have a negative impact somewhere else, we don't do it. There's a good reason, but it's hard to be able for Jim or others to explain why we didn't do what the public wanted.
I think Chris is I think the lasting damage, I think Chris is exactly right. The lasting damage will be to the fact that there will be some terrible stories about the Afghans who helped our military and who helped our embassy. There will be some terrible stories about that. We didn't make an ironclad commitment to get them out. Frankly, we weren't in a position to do so. And to be bipartisan in the allocation of blame, which I would offer up, because there's a lot of wacky ideas out there. Why didn't you just hang on to Bagram, right? How come you don't keep 4,000 people there? Well, you know what? The Taliban now run the country, right? Keeping Bagram and keeping 4,000 people, that involves a force protection element that is massive. But I do think that the lasting pain, the lasting repercussions will be that the next time we go somewhere on a dangerous mission, people are going to think a lot harder about whether they want to help us out and make that calculation. Credibility, I don't know. I mean, I said this in my opening remarks. The president did what he said he was going to do. After 3 presidents said they were going to do it and didn't. And again, I promised to be sort of bipartisan, riffing on what Congressman Shays said. I think the Biden administration, my own view is that they will be accountable for the fact that they did not plan for the worst case scenario. They had, I point this out to the press, in January, there were more troops protecting the United States Congress on Capitol Hill than there were in Afghanistan. You had the capability to do nothing. You couldn't even protect the airport with what we had in January. And for some reason, the people who were charged with envisioning the worst case scenario and stopping 13 service people from being killed didn't plan for the worst case scenario. I think that's on this administration. The last administration, just to riff a little bit on what Congressman Shays was saying, not only did we not consult, but when the Trump administration decided to negotiate a peace in Afghanistan, they didn't invite Afghanistan. Right? I mean, imagine what it's like to be in the Afghan military and Mike Pompeo is negotiating with Baradar, and we shut out Ghani and his people. I mean, in that moment, if I'm a captain in the Afghan military, I'm like, I see which way this is going.
Let me add a little to that, because I chair the Commission on Wartime Contracting. Half of our military effort were contractors, rightfully so. The American people don't. Why would we want Marines to guard a base? Why would we want Marines to do the wash? Why would we want the Army to cook? So we brought in outsiders. We brought in outsiders to manage and maintain the planes. Well, when we left, we took a lot of those contractors away, so the Afghan Air Force wasn't certain that they had planes that could fly. So just taking that group away was a real lesson.
Let me ask, I'll begin with Congressman Himes and then go to Congressman Shays. You both made comments about having to reassess our defense postures in terms of strategic doctrine, tactical capabilities. We all know that foreign policy is an extension of national security an extension of foreign policy. The House Armed Services Committee, as Congressman Himes knows, just reported a DoD authorization that is above what President Biden requested. I think over $700 billion, is it, Congressman Himes? Something. Okay, so given the experience that we've had over the past 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq, thinking about how we move forward, do we need defense budgets of over $700 billion? And what would each of you do? What do you think needs to be done to reassess how we're investing in defense, in soft power and hard power? What are the key changes that you believe are necessary in our defense budgets?
Let me go first on that. So, just to bound this for you, if you add in the intelligence community budget, which is 85 billion plus or minus, you get above 800 billion. That's a number that is, I think, it changes, but it's something like the next 8 or 9 powers combined. China, Russia, UK, France, combined. And a lot of those people are, of course, are not our antagonists. And so, yeah. And look, this gets way out of the realm of foreign policy, right? At someday, it turns out we really like tax cuts and we really like spending $800 billion, and we can do that. We can do that, but don't then expect us to rebuild bridges or highways or electric charging vehicles or have a decent system of education. I mean, this is just a hard fact, right? But I wish I had something optimistic. I don't know how you cut the defense budget, because the last thing I want to say before I punt this to Congressman Shays is 2 things. Number one, we should all have, and I hope you've heard us all emanate deep respect for the military, but we shouldn't worship them. I was with a Republican member of Congress in Salt Lake City 4 weeks ago who said that the Pentagon should not be a budget item, and the implication was that we should just spend an unlimited amount on our national security. And that if you somehow say, no, we shouldn't build another F-35, heaven forbid, they're built in Connecticut, at least the engines, that you're somehow unpatriotic or you're not supporting our troops. So we've turned support for the military in terms of one of the things a box you need to check if you're a real patriot. That's much more aggressive on the right wing of our political spectrum than it is on the left wing of the political spectrum. But that's a problem. And the other huge problem, as you might have surmised by my comment about the F-35s, is, I mean, let's face it, the military budget is a massive employment program for 535 members of Congress. And I'll sit here all day long. Well, let me tell you a real story. I'll tell you a real story. I'm a freshman in the Congress, and for a Democrat, I'm pretty serious about deficits in the budget, so Barack Obama, the new president, says we don't want to build F-22s. The Air Force says we don't want F-22s. We're building an F-35. We don't want F-22s. And Barack Obama goes as far to say that I'll veto a budget that has the F-22 in it. And Himes, who considers himself serious about the budget, writes a letter with a bunch of other people saying, let's keep building F-22s. Why? Because the engines for the F-22s are built in Connecticut. And as long as that connection exists, it's going to be pretty darn hard.
You wouldn't do that today.
You have more respect for me than I do.
You know what? I will make a point, though. I will make a point. I don't fault any congressman from defending, say, keeping a base, because his constituents need an advocate. I just fault all the other members who vote along with him, or her. Your question basically is, are we spending too much in the military? And I would.
Or how would you change the budget? What
let me
priorities would you pursue?
Let me just say it this way. We are more at war we are more in contest economically than militarily. And our economy matters. The Chinese will have a larger, more significant economy than the United States in a number of years. It won't be per capita. We'll still be the most per capita. But given their numbers, they will have a huge economic advantage. And they're smart. They may spend, and I know advocates for the military say, well, they're increasing their budget, 20% or so. Yeah, based on a really smaller amount. I said 20, I don't know what it is. But it's based on a smaller amount. They know that their economic strength is where they really are in battle with us, not their military strength.
And economic strength is about investment in people, right?
People, absolutely.
Education. Yeah.
Healthcare, dealing with climate change, dealing with everything that will make us a stronger country economically and a better country.
Just a small, quick story. So in 2006, I worked on the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review, and my first day, I came in and this 3-star Air Force general said, the number you need to know is 283. And it was the number of F-22s. Not that they thought they needed, but the number they would start with so that they would get down to the number they actually wanted. And so that if you needed to start high and then eventually you'd get down to what you wanted. But this seems like a structural issue that is, as you're suggesting, that if we have 500, this has essentially become a jobs program. And so that seems like it's something that's really hard to kind of get around. I mean,
let me just make a small point. When we went into, it's not a small point, it's a big point for me. When we went into Iraq the first time, and we were highly successful, but realized that we were confronting a nation that didn't have much. But I had a member of Congress that said, Shays, we succeeded there not because of you, because these were votes that took place 10 years previous. In other words, by the time you have what you want, it takes 10 years. And so one of the challenges that Jim has is, what do I do now that will make sure we're strong 10 years from now? And that's a difficult question sometimes.
Really quick comment, just to throw a grenade into the proceedings here. We haven't talked about Taiwan, and so why does the military budget look like what it does? Because we might have to fight the Chinese over Taiwan while we're fighting another battle somewhere else, right? I do think, having not provided any constructive suggestions on how we might reduce the military budget, we should be a lot more honest with each other about what we're really going to do. And I know that from a negotiation standpoint, it's terrible to say we're not going to fight the Chinese. I get that. If the Chinese don't think we're going to fight them, you got this situation where they feel empowered and emboldened, maybe. But look, Taiwan. If we get into an Iraq War situation, I vaguely remember, I wasn't in Congress, but and Congressman Shays was, where the feeling is there's weapons of mass destruction, this is our national honor at stake, this is finishing the work that we left unfinished in Kuwait and everything else, and we're going to go in. Look, we could sell that. The Chinese are the biggest threat to American national security. I could sell that if I wanted to. When Taiwan goes, the next thing you know, they're in Japan. Now, by the way, that's absurd, but that's what will get said. I've heard it said by people with stars on their shoulders. If Taiwan goes, the next thing you know, they're in Japan. So I can imagine how that gets sold, but really, this is an island that has been Chinese since the Qing dynasty kicked out the Dutch or the Spanish, whoever it was, in 1682, right? This is a Chinese island. And a war, first of all, I'm not sure that we win a war against the Chinese over Taiwan. Maybe we do, but boy, you didn't like Afghanistan with its 2,400 deaths and $2 trillion in expenses? That's an appetizer compared to what we spend and what we lose in Taiwan to keep a Chinese island from being slightly different version, politically speaking, of China. So my point is that maybe we ought to start being honest about what we're really going to do. Are we going to go to war, a major war with a nuclear power? Because if the answer to that question is we might, we're going to get to $800 billion pretty quickly.
What, Jim, you triggered something that I've always believed. A member of Congress needs to listen, they need to learn, they need to help, they need to teach, and they need to lead. and we don't have much listening with our constituents, they're getting incredible information on TV that is so false. They're getting incredible information from members of Congress who are teaching the wrong things, and they know them to be wrong. And that's kind of distorted where our public policy is. It distorts our military effort, it distorts our soft power State Department effort.
Chris talked a little bit about the military-industrial complex. There's this word out there now about the blob. The blob is, I guess, the Washington foreign policy establishment, and the blob does seem to want to use its toys, right? Maybe that's crassly economic, because the more toys you're using, the more toys the government needs to buy. But they use words like credibility. Like, if the Chinese invade Taiwan, is that a huge what? Is that does that damage U.S. credibility? Probably, but what's the alternative? What does a war with China? By the way, I had this opportunity. You got me going now, Steve. I had this opportunity to ask some very senior national security professionals about do we have the same sort of command and control and relationships with the Chinese that we had with the Soviets in the Cold War. Pretty amazing when you read this history. Generals were on the phone with each other all the time. U.S., Soviet, they knew each other's nuclear protocols. They were on the and the answer I got back in a closed hearing was, we got none of that. We got none of that. So there is zero confidence in the possibility that we get into even a skirmish, we sink a Chinese battleship, there is zero confidence that that doesn't lead to a nuclear response. That's something we better think about when we use words like credibility.
And what Jim is pointing out is there's been no dialogue with the American people about this. But what we learned, I at least learned recently, but I should have known sooner, that there was a Russian sub where 3 people in the sub had determined during the Cuban crisis whether to launch a military nuclear weapon. And they were out of touch with the country of Russia, their leadership, and 2 of the 3 voted to use the weapons. This is a reality that we have to also confront. And there's very little dialogue about what we tell the Chinese and the Russians on how do we reduce that risk. Could I just do something that I promised Tim Romer I would do?
Yes, yes. So
wait?
let's do this. Let's ask unanimous consent for another 20 minutes. Okay, and that way we'll have 20 minutes of Q&A. Is that okay? 15? Okay.
Tim Romer was
15 minutes. You get a minute, and then they get 14.
Okay. Tim Romer was going to be replacing one of us, and I think he's brilliant. I think he did an incredible job when he was ambassador to India, getting India to come more into our column. And he gave me, if he was here, he said, this is what our foreign policy should be. Rebuild partnership with Europe. China and Russia, don't unite them, and confront them when they are confronting us, but work with them anytime we can possibly work with them. Have a deeper alliance with Japan, Australia, and Indonesia that will be important in dealing with China. Stress democratic institutions. And then he said, keep an eye on terrorism. And I just would add, promote U.S. economic growth and strengthen our political system.
All right, well, thank you for that. Of course, Tim Romer, a member of Congress, member of the Intelligence Committee, U.S. Ambassador to India, and has been featured on various Cornell Institute of Politics programs and on the 9/11 Commission. All right, these gentlemen have been very generous because we promised them a hard stop of 7:15, but we did start late, so we've now got 13 minutes. We'll try and accommodate as many questions as we can. Let's begin over here, Matt, please.
Okay, I think what's troubling me a bit is...
Do you have a mic for this?
Yes, why don't you bring the mic over? And if you could, respect the confines of time, ask your question very briskly, please. Everybody, not just you, ma'am, everybody.
Jim and I will try to...
For saving the democratic system, which is...
You need that on if people are listening from outside.
Here, use mine, please. Here, go ahead.
it doesn't work, okay, retract my comment.
We will repeat your question. Go ahead.
Does saving democracy, albeit flawed, in Taiwan or even Hong Kong play any role in your calculation as to where it's worth fighting and where it isn't? If you look at places like Iraq or Afghanistan, the governments never were democratic. You look at Iran, as you gave an example of Nicaragua, they were somewhat democratic. So doesn't that play a role in the equation of what we're doing and what we stand for?
You don't have to repeat that. We can
Okay.
hear.
Yeah. It's hard to look at the last 100 years and say that you're going to have a much higher probability of preserving a democratic government in a place that has had experience with democratic rule, and not just democratic rule, but the institutions of democracy, free press and everything, than you are in Afghanistan, which has never had any of the institutions. Taiwan, you asked about Taiwan. Taiwan's sort of an interesting case, right? I mean, it is a democracy. The way Hong Kong was, but then, of course, there's no question that there are countries where you can preserve or help democracy along, preserve it better than other countries, but you have to factor in what does it cost you to override an invasion. Look, we reversed the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. We chose not to reverse the Russian invasion of Crimea. What's the factor? My guess is it's probably nuclear weapons.
And the fact that they're right next door to each other. Why the heck did we try to encroach on Russia after the Cold War to the point that we're saying that they're going to be part of NATO? How would we react if the Russians united Canada and Mexico against us?
Next question. Let's take it from this side. Yes, sir.
So it would be safe to say that. Oh, sorry. So it would be safe to say that after Afghanistan, U.S. appetite for the use of force overseas is diminished. So this raises the obvious question, well, then what are the other instruments we're going to be using? And one of the ones that we seem to be very happy to use, particularly over the last 20 years, is economic sanctions, which is really odd because they don't seem to work terribly well. And furthermore, cause, in some ways, a significant amount of humanitarian suffering as well. I guess my question is, to what extent do you think we need to rethink all the tools of foreign policy, not just the use of force?
Very quickly, I think you're exactly right about sanctions. They tend to work when you have almost global unanimity. Without in any way saying that the JCPOA was good or bad, because that's a whole other hour, the world coming together to economically sanction Iran got them to the table. So to me, sanctions feel like a tool that works pretty well when you can get something close to unanimity. Obviously, if the Chinese are not on board, it doesn't really work. But no, I do. Congressman Shays said it exactly right. Yeah, we do need to rethink all of the other tools. Our commitment to our allies, the way we work together. Because if we're going to do a lot less foreign expeditionary activity, which I suspect, given the last 30 years, is a good idea, we're going to have to really emphasize how we work with our allies. I mean, it almost pains me to say it, but because it's so hard, but how we work with the UN and other organizations like that to achieve our ends.
Economic sanctions open the door for the Russians and the Chinese to step in, and they should be used with great reluctance.
We will take two more questions. Let's go. Yes, sir. Yeah. Love to see some of my students ask questions for extra credit, by the way.
So if Taiwan doesn't meet the red line standard for military action, what does? And I'll throw three examples out. Eastern Central Europe, Korea, and the upcoming land grab under the polar ice cap.
My sense is that Jim and I both believe that Taiwan is a key factor, and we have to make sure the Chinese know that our society, whether individual members don't want to deal with it, are going to step in. Taiwan is just too important economically. It has a technology that is essential to us, and if we ever give the Chinese a feeling that they can just blithely come in, that would be a mistake, and I would think you would agree with that.
I think it's very hard, and I guess what we need to do is think about this with a level of sophistication that is worthy of the problem.
So we would do something economically. I mean, it doesn't mean we go to war, but we would make life so difficult.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a really hard case, right? Because very few countries on the planet recognize the sovereignty of Taiwan. And by the way, there's Chinese politics here too, right? What would be the dumbest thing the Chinese could do would be to trash the economy of Taiwan. I mean, that would have global implications. So, look, all I can tell you, I think a previous question from the professor got it exactly right. I actually don't. I think it's a double-edged sword, the current mood of reluctance to use our military. I can tell you what the 730,000 people I represent, if the case for war with Taiwan were laid out, it would not be an easy vote, and that's for sure. And I think that may be one of the downsides. I hope no one's gotten the impression that I believe, or that any of us up here believe, that the military doesn't have a really important role. And so it is also, we're in this echo moment right now where the fact that Afghanistan and Iraq ended the way they did, I think has Americans way back on their heels with respect to the contemplation of military action.
Professor, you're the final question.
So we've been talking about U.S. foreign policy, but you're members of Congress, and so I'm curious, how much do your constituents care about foreign policy when they decide an election? So whether it's the midterms or, in 2024, how much do you think this is likely to weigh on your constituents?
We represented the same constituents, and I don't know how our constituents have changed, but I think they do care. I think they care about our country doing things well. I think they want our leaders to not make mistakes, foolish mistakes. And I think right now there's a real, I don't know, Jim, what it's like to represent the 4th District now, but I suspect that even throughout the country, we need to think of some positive things that are happening. Let me back up. Most of my constituents said no, less foreign aid, and I would say, really? We spend this little amount and it's soft power? To me, some of the most impressive people in our country, besides the military folks, are our State Department people whenever we went there. And so I always felt it was my job to make sure people understood how important it is. If you want less people trying to get into the United States through Mexico, we're going to have to deal with their economies back home and their security, try to help them, not military occupation. So I wish I hadn't answered that question. I wish I'd let you go first.
Jim, you're going to be the final word?
Well, I mean, just very quickly, I mean, in the aggregate, you're asking about Fairfield County here, which is a very educated, pretty affluent place, right? So it's not necessarily representative of the country. The country as a whole is famously uninterested in foreign policy. They get interested, of course, when there's an existential threat, whether it's the Soviets or the Nazis, and of course they get really interested when their sons and daughters start getting committed to foreign battlefields.
That's the better answer.
They get very, very interested. But Chris is exactly right. One of the reasons he keeps saying we need to do a better job educating, which I guess is part of the reason that we're here. Foreign policy is really hard. I've been thinking now about the Middle East for a long time, as I know Congressman Shays did. It's unnatural for Americans to contemplate a problem which has a series of bad answers. And you're choosing the least bad answer. That's not an American way. We sort of believe that if we just work hard enough and do the right things, we're going to get a good answer. But gosh, whether it's Taiwan or Iraq or Afghanistan or Venezuela, there's a series of really tough answers.
And if I could just inject this.
Quickly.
When you add what happened in the Turkish embassy, and we are horrified that a person could be literally chopped up and taken out, I asked a number of my friends in the Middle East, and they said that didn't shock any of us. That didn't anger any of us. That was something they could accept in their society. And to us, it's so outrageous. That's the difference.
Let me just provide a 10-second summation of that question, and then we're going to wrap it up. I'm going to make an announcement about our next program. I chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee for 4 years, as both Jim and Chris know. We are in the most negative partisan environment that we have been in since the 19th century, mid-19th century. 40% of the electorate, no matter what foreign policy successes we achieve, are voting against Joe Biden. And 40% of the electorate, no matter what foreign policy blunders and failures we experience, are voting for Joe Biden, or writ large Democrats. The 20% that are left, those swing voters, fewer and fewer now living across maybe 20 congressional districts. I've never seen data that tells me that they are influenced by foreign policy decisions when they go to the polls. They're influenced by health, the economy, jobs, debt, inflation, but not foreign policy. So we'll see how this plays out. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're interested, particularly to those who are viewing us, if you're interested in more information about the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell, just Google Cornell Institute of Politics. You'll see all of our programs. Our next program is going to be quite fascinating. Not as fascinating as this, but we have secured an Afghan translator who was a sergeant for the United States Army, who was able to leave Afghanistan. His family remained behind. They were just rescued. They're in the UAE now. He'll be providing his perspectives to us. And finally, these two gentlemen, I hope that you appreciate, they're used to sitting next to each other at tables like this. They did it over the course of a campaign, very frequently disagreeing with one another in a
But he
campaign.
was always respectful.
In a campaign environment. The point I'm making is, with all the partisanship and the screaming and the yelling, isn't it refreshing to have two members of Congress who opposed one another come together to talk about areas of common ground? That's what we are. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you all.